Welcome back. We're now going to continue over here with novel, and as I say, I'm going to, in this video, attempt to tie together novel and this other concept of Menippean satire, because the two of them actually overlap. They show an intermingling of the two genres of satire and novel, and that's why we put them together this way. Okay, so let's talk about novel now. Novel, interestingly, is entirely non-existent in most of Greek literature until mid to late Hellenistic, which means 2nd and 1st centuries BC. Novel is prose fiction, meaning fiction that is not written in poetry. And when one examines fictional works through most of Greek literature until their takeover by the Romans, we see that the major works of Greek literature that are fiction, like mythology, for instance, are always written in poetry. You can get epic meter, like with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. You can get the typical conversational tragic meter, the iambic trimeter, which is used for most of tragedy and comedy, except when you have choruses, when they have their own choral or lyric meters, and so forth. But it's all poetry. Prose is used for nonfiction, which would mean, for instance, history or philosophy or didactic works such as science and astronomy that came up in Hellenistic times. But the idea of prose fiction took quite a long time to develop. And as such, we in fact have, in the case of the Greek world, only 5 surviving examples of novel. And the most famous one that was the inspiration for later operas is Daphnis and Chloe, which is a love story, essentially. Now, one of the reasons why there's an overlap between novel and satire is that the subject matter of novel is also what sometimes comes up in satires, and that's actually going to bring us around to this concept of Menippean satire in a little bit. Novel is often somewhat similar in its subject matter to the way Greek Middle, New, and Roman comedies all work, in the sense of having generic human nature failure types of topics. The most common is a silly young man who is in love with a really, really beautiful and probably brainless young lady who is in some way inaccessible to the man. In some cases, she may have been kidnapped and hauled off someplace, or as we see with comedy, she might have been purchased as a prostitute and be in some major's possession or whoever it is. And so the novel often involves the misadventures of the male lover and the female beloved trying to get back together again, and then after some kind of a rescue process, getting past some enemy, or slaying a dragon or whatever it might be, that kind of stuff. Just think of Leia and New Hope on the Death Star and such. Then we get the lady away, and then we try to get away, but then there's usually some bump in the road about trying to get away. If they get on board a ship and they sail someplace, inevitably there's a shipwreck, and so things don't end up coming out very well necessarily, but eventually they get to where they need to get to, and they finally are reconnected, or in some cases it does not work out, as in the case of the work by Rimsky-Korsakov called Scheherazade. There's a shipwreck and nobody survives that, and so on. So novel basically has that kind of typical love-driven misadventure contained inside of it, and that's what the theme of the Daphnis Chloe novel is about. So, as you say, there are only 5 examples surviving from the ancient Greek world. We do somewhat better with novel in the Roman world. We have 2 major ones: the one by Seneca and also the one by Petronius. These 2 authors wrote prior to and then under the reign of Emperor Nero. So we're talking now 50s and 60s AD. So Nero was the emperor, was the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors, and he was emperor after Claudius. Now, Seneca and Petronius both had been 2 of several tutors whom Nero had prior to his becoming emperor, and they in fact were to be credited for some of the successes that Nero had in the first years of his principate, before things went really downhill later, especially with the Great Fire that struck Rome in AD 64. So both Seneca and Petronius wrote satiric works. Seneca wrote a work with a long name in Greek, apokolokyntosis, which is similar to a Greek word apotheosis. Now, what does that all mean? Apotheosis is the proper Greek word for the deification of a figure like the Roman Empire, basically turning him into a god to be worshipped after his death. So that's the proper procedure that often happened with the emperors, unless they were unsuccessful, in which case they were not allowed to have this. The emperors would be deified upon their deaths and celebrated as gods, worshipped as gods afterwards. So Augustus, for instance, the first Roman emperor, was worshipped as divine Augustus after his death. So apokollikantosis is a joke on that. That means pumpkinification, that turning somebody into a pumpkin. Oddly, the work itself doesn't have any reference to a pumpkin in it, but what it basically refers to is the disgrace that's attached to Emperor Claudius because of a number of unjust verdicts of death, verdicts, I should say, of guilty and sentences of death carried out against various friends and family members whom he had, allegedly, and he ends up suffering divine punishment in the form of becoming a law clerk for his nephew, the utterly insane prior emperor Gaius, the one known as Caligula, or Little Boot. And so we have here is a pillorying of Emperor Claudius in an effort to raise the spirits of Emperor Nero to suggest that he will become a real savior for the Roman world. And of course, Seneca must have been quite chagrined in later years to discover that his great efforts to make Nero look great were in vain, in fact. So that's an example of a Roman novel. Then we have Seneca's contemporary Petronius, who wrote a work called Satyricon, which is the songs of the satyrs. Satyrs are the half men, half goats, worshippers of either Dionysus in the Greek world or Bacchus in the Roman world. And the Satyricon is another kind of love story, but it's sort of flipped around. What we have here is a man who has been struck impotent by the god Priapus, the nature god who is also the god of sexuality, as it turns out. It's a little bit similar to Poseidon torturing the hero Odysseus. So here we have this guy Encolpius, who spends something like 16 books in all sorts of misadventures. And the problem is that Encolpius has a young man who is his own beloved. And because he cannot get to him, since he is impotent, he's trying to protect this young boy from other men who want to get at him. And so most of the misadventures involve his trying to keep the boy under his control, and the boy gets away, gets spirited away somewhere else, and so forth. And so this goes on for apparently about 20 books, and we don't have a lot of it surviving. Only parts of the 16th book get through to us. The major episode that happens that luckily does survive for us is a dinner party by a very, very wealthy freedman named Trimalchio. The dinner party is quite disgusting. It's this really, really excessively opulent and lavish multi-course dinner with one course after another, and each one getting more and more extravagant and oftentimes disgusting, and with certain things going on with the meals that really make them inedible and such. And so we end up with this really pretty awful dinner party, and the young men who are actually being pursued by a brothel woman from whom they stole something are hiding out in this dinner party, trying to escape her attention. And when they get in there and they get stuck in this meal, they sort of are sorry that they end up there, because things that go on there are just totally off the wall. And it's a satire on the Roman cultural aspect of wealthy freedmen who are successful in business after they get set free from being slaves in the past, showing that certain freedmen are so successful in business that they end up wretched to the point of stupidity. And once they get that way, they end up essentially carrying on with everybody else around them, other freedmen who have to come and pay services to them and so forth. They're their patrons, and everybody else around them are clients waiting for handouts, and they're dependent on them. And so we end up with a very tense relationship that's very typical of Roman patron-client relationships, with this extravagant guy, and then all the clients around him who are dependent on him and really don't want to be at this dinner party at all for very good reason. So that's the second novel. And then finally we have Apuleius. His work called The Metamorphoses, or The Golden Ass, is about a man who gets turned into an ass, a donkey more exactly, a man named Lucius, who tries to have this witch show him how to turn into an owl by drinking a potion because he wants to impress his girlfriend. And she does it, except that she gets the ingredients mixed up, and he gets turned into a donkey. And then he gets stolen by thieves from her, and he has to go around with all the thieves. She tells him, eat a white rose. That'll get you back into a man form. But because he's with the thieves, he can't do it because otherwise he'll be defenseless. And so the various adventures take him around also. And eventually he becomes a priest of Isis, of all things, in Egypt. And that's how the story ends up ending, because Apuleius was a devout religious author of it in his own right, and ends with a moralizing note for his audience about the way that they should behave, having watched examples of how not to behave through the eyes of the donkey Lucius. Okay, so those are the major surviving examples of novel that we have in the Roman world. Now, the concept of Menippean satire that's been mentioned here is the mixture of prose and poetry into one work of literature. And Menippean refers to an author named Menippus from Greek literature, who was the author of so-called Milesian tales, which were these tales that would start off on one track, but then would go off on other tracks, so that you would end up with these mixture of stories all together. So that has several themes that I've mentioned in these videos. The idea of mixed topics comes up here, where the satire can be whatever topic the author wants to be, and oftentimes the author's topics get all mixed in together. The idea in the novel that you might start off again on one track, but then you might tell a side story along the way and go off on that and have a story that's laid inside the major story. You have that. And so these Milesian tales are just random stories that go from one to the other, and the later stories are often intermingled with the earlier ones, and are often told within the context of those earlier ones. So in the case of Petronius and Satyricon, we have several pieces of poetry that come up in them. One is called the Fall of Troy. It's a takeoff on the Virgil Book 2, describing the fall of Troy with the Trojan horse and so forth, but it's a whole aria describing, in poetry form, describing the fall of Troy within the prose context. Unfortunately, the work is so fragmentary that we don't know exactly where it fits, but apparently that song was sung, guess what, on board a ship before the ship itself hit a storm and ended up sinking. That was one of the places where the authors who were trying to run away from trouble were trying to hide out, and they ended up encountering more trouble in the form of suddenly ending up in the water. There's also another famous inserted tale in Petronius Satyricon called The Widow of Ephesus, all about the perfectly chaste widow who is basically dying and wasting away inside the tomb of her husband, who has just recently been encased inside a mausoleum. She's inside the mausoleum with him and acting completely chastely, totally devoted to him, doesn't want to leave. And then a soldier who has to guard some corpses nearby that are on crucifixes comes by. I'll leave you to find that story within Petronius Satyricon to say what happens, but it's quite an amusing take on the perfectly chaste woman. There's the myth in Roman foundation period, the rape of Lucretia, about the perfectly chaste woman who commits suicide because she's raped. And this appears to maybe to be a takeoff on that idea, that in this case the soldier encounters this woman and manages to convince her to connect with him, and so she ends up not being as chaste. But I'll leave you to see the details, the kicker at the end of the story for yourself. So that's another example of an inserted tale. And the famous myth of Cupid and Psyche is an inserted tale that we find, quite a lengthy one, in Apuleius's Metamorphoses. It's a story that Lucius, the donkey, overhears one person telling another person at one point there. And so the Cupid-Psyche myth has its best representation for us as an inserted tale there. So the idea of the inserted tales occurs all over the place with satire and novel, and then with Menippean satire we take that to an additional dimension, and that is we have poetry inserted within the prose. The first author who experimented with Menippean satire as the genre came to be known was the Roman 1st century BC author Varro, who was quite prolific with many different kinds of genres. He was an historian and an antiquarian, but he also worked with poetry quite a bit, and he wrote quite a few Menippean satires that unfortunately we have lost now. But that's where the genre first developed. And then, as I say, Menippean satire for us gets its best representation with Seneca and with Petronius. Not, however, with Apuleius. Apuleius's other work, the Golden Ass, does not actually have any poetry as such in it, even though it does catch that idea about tales inserted within tales. So, okay, that's a quick run through of the satires as we have it. We have one last quick video that I'm going to attach on. Again, the two handouts that you got off Sakai, the one by Xenophon and the one by Horace. So in our final video that we have here, we will cover those two works. Okay, see you next video.